On Thanksgiving, the world around me seemed to collapse in a single shattering moment as the sound of ceramic breaking filled the dining room and time folded into something slow and unreal. I remember standing near the edge of the table, holding a bowl of rolls and thinking the day might still be saved despite the tension humming under every breath. Then everything shifted. A sudden impact rushed through me, not described by sharpness or pain, but by the overwhelming sense of losing balance inside my own body. My vision blurred as voices rose around me and the floor tilted. I could hear Caroline shouting my name, though her voice flickered in and out like a radio struggling to catch a distant signal. Something in the air smelled faintly burnt. Maybe the turkey left unattended while arguments simmered, but it mixed strangely with the heavy silence that followed the noise. I did not fall immediately. I stood suspended in a moment that felt borrowed, trying to understand why my father was still yelling, even as everything inside me dimmed. He sounded accusatory, as if whatever had just happened was an offense committed against him rather than something that involved me. "Look what you made me do" was the phrase that reached me most clearly, not because it was loud, but because it carried an old familiarity that lodged somewhere deep and unwelcome. The room swayed gently, as though I were on a boat, rather than standing in my childhood home, decorated with strings of paper leaves taped unevenly along the walls. Someone touched my arm, maybe trying to steady me, yet the contact barely registered. The world had gone soft around the edges. I remember thinking I needed to breathe more deeply, but even that felt like a suggestion I could not follow. The next thing I understood was motion. Hands guided me somewhere I could not see. The lights seemed too bright, or maybe my eyes were too slow to keep up with them. My knees buckled briefly, though I do not recall hitting the ground. Voices blurred again. Caroline sounded frantic while my father's tone shifted between anger and something I could not name. I wanted to tell everyone I was fine, even though I knew I was not, when cold air brushed my face. I realized we were outside, and then the wail of approaching sirens cut through whatever fog. I remember a paramedic asking me questions, simple ones, the kind meant to anchor a drifting mind. My answers came slowly wrapped in hesitation, as if each word needed permission before leaving my mouth. The ride in the ambulance felt both fast and dreamlike. I watched ceiling lights flash overhead while someone checked my pulse and another voice reminded me to stay awake. I wanted to ask what had happened, though deep down I already knew. The memory was softened, yet unmistakably present. Something had connected with my head, and the echo of it remained inside me long after At the hospital, the familiarity of the environment offered little comfort. I had walked these halls countless times as a nurse, but moving through them as a patient placed everything at a distance. I felt detached from the rhythm of the place, hearing beeping monitors and hurried footsteps as if they belonged to another world. Someone placed a blanket over me and another adjusted the lights. Questions circled me again, yet I could only answer some of them. When they rolled me toward imaging, I closed my eyes and tried to steady the rising unease that pressed against my ribs. When the doctor entered the room, his expression was measured in a way that immediately unsettled me. He spoke gently, asking how I felt and whether I remembered the events of the evening. I told him fragments careful and uncertain, while he nodded in a manner that suggested he had already seen the scans. He pulled a small stool closer and explained that some findings required attention. His tone was steady, yet serious enough to pull my drifting thoughts back into place. He described a fragment likely from whatever had struck me, though he did not linger on the specifics. Then he paused long enough for my breath to catch. "There was something else," he said, "something older, something that did not match the fresh nature of the evening's incident." His words moved slowly, as though he was choosing each with care. They had found another object, one that appeared to have been there for years, resting near bone in a way that suggested an old injury. I stared at him, trying to assemble sense from uncertainty. I knew the recent moment of chaos, but the idea of something hidden inside me from long ago reached deeper than the confusion. I felt the room grow quieter, even though machines continued their steady patterns around me. The doctor waited, giving me space to understand without rushing my response. Something inside my chest tightened as I tried to recall any moment from childhood that could explain what he described. Nothing clear surfaced, only scattered impressions that dissolved when I reached for them. The uncertainty created a strange heaviness, as if my own history had shifted beneath my feet. The doctor assured me they would run additional tests and that I was safe, yet the word safe echoed in my mind like a that was the moment when everything aligned into a single realization that pressed through the haze surrounding me. Whatever had been discovered was not simply a medical detail, but a doorway to something in my past I had never fully grasped. I listened carefully as the doctor outlined next steps. Though his voice felt distant, my thoughts circled back to the chaos at the house, the raised voices, the sudden shift from tension to something irreversible. When he finally asked if I had support, I hesitated. The truth was still forming, yet I sensed that this incident had uncovered more. Melissa Carter was 34 years old when that Thanksgiving unraveled, but the truth is that the threads had been fraying for far longer than I ever wanted to admit. In the days after the hospital visit, when the shock had not yet settled and my thoughts floated between numbness and clarity, I kept replaying the years that had led me back to that house, as though some part of me needed to understand why I had returned at all. I worked as an ER nurse, a job built on urgency, compassion, and constant motion. I had spent more nights than I could count caring for strangers who arrived frightened and broken, yet I always found the grounding to meet each crisis with calm. People trusted me with their worst moments, and in that environment I felt capable and steady. None of that confidence ever seemed to matter once I crossed the threshold into my father's home. The Carter household had its own gravity pulling me backward into roles I thought I had outgrown. My father, James, was a man who clung to control the way others cling to faith. He had been strict when I was a child, stern as an adult, and unpredictable in ways that set the tone for every conversation. People outside the family often described him as hardworking or no-nonsense, but those words never captured the tension that sat like a shadow over our home. My younger sister Caroline was 29 and had lived with him on and off since high school, drifting between part-time jobs that never stayed long. She had a talent for storytelling, the kind that could charm or manipulate depending on her motive. When she laughed, she reminded me of the version of us that once existed a time before the weight of unspoken things had settled across our family. Yet when she turned that same talent toward criticism, she could slice through any confidence I had built. Growing up, Caroline was always the favorite in ways subtle enough to deny, but obvious enough that they shaped my understanding of belonging. If she broke something, I apologized. If she became upset, I soothed her. If she spun a story that placed blame on someone else, our father rarely questioned it. As adults, those patterns followed us into rooms I never intended them to enter. Even after I moved out at 22, determined to define my own life, their calls tugged at me, and I often found myself returning not out of obligation, but out of the fragile hope that maybe the past could be rewritten into something softer. When Caroline called me that November, insisting that Thanksgiving would fall apart without me, I knew the script before she spoke it. She said she needed help with groceries and planning and decorations, that she had been overwhelmed since taking on extra shifts at her latest job. She reminded me that family traditions mattered and that Dad missed me, though he rarely said it. She said the holiday would feel incomplete without all of us together. Each reason slipped neatly into a place carved by years of habit. I wanted to believe that being present might somehow anchor the three of us back into alignment. So I agreed, even though a part of me tightened at the thought of returning to the place where my childhood felt both distant and strangely near. Driving through my hometown that morning, I noticed how familiar the streets looked despite the years I had spent away. The cold Pennsylvania air held the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves, as if the whole town had prepared for the season. Passing the playground I once loved, I felt a faint flicker of memory, something warm and uncomplicated that stood in contrast to the heaviness I carried. When I reached the house, the front yard looked almost unchanged. The porch railing was still slightly crooked from a storm years ago, and the windows reflected the gray sky in a way that gave the house an expression both watchful and tired. Inside, Caroline was already bustling around the kitchen, her voice moving quickly as she explained what still needed to be done. She spoke as if we were partners in some shared mission, and for a moment I let myself imagine that this time would be different. James was quieter than usual that morning, offering only a brief nod in my direction before returning to his newspaper. The tension between us was an old companion, unwelcome but familiar. He had a way of filling silence with disapproval, even without speaking. Still, I tried to ease into the day, reminding myself that I was here by choice, and that perhaps the evening might end without conflict. Yet beneath that hopeful thought lived the echo of something else, a vague unease I had carried since childhood. There was a small scar on the side of my head, barely visible beneath my hair, one I had noticed only in passing over the years. Whenever I asked about it, my father dismissed the question, saying I had fallen when I was young. Caroline echoed his explanation, even though she was too little to remember. Something about that story never sat comfortably in my mind, yet I never pushed further. Working in the ER had taught me that people often bury uncomfortable truths under simple explanations. Families especially. Throughout the day, little things stirred that sense of unease. The way Caroline criticized, the way I chopped vegetables, the way James's expression tightened each time I suggested something. The feeling that I was stepping back into a role I had not chosen, but one that expected silence in exchange for acceptance. Still I stayed. Not out of duty, but out of hope, the fragile kind that insists on giving second chances even when history warns otherwise. As the afternoon faded into evening, I found myself wondering why I had always returned. Maybe some part of me still wanted to believe that a family could be mended with enough patience. Maybe I had been trained to think endurance was the same as love. Maybe I simply wanted one holiday when we were not shattered pieces trying to fit into old shapes. Whatever the reason I told myself that tonight, I would hold on to grace for as long as I could. I did not know then how quickly that hope would slip through my hands, or how the events of that night would cast every memory into a new and unsettling light. Growing up in the Carter house meant learning to read silence the way other children learned to read bedtime stories, because silence carried warnings far louder than raised voices. And long before I understood what fear was supposed to feel like, I understood the weight of waiting for my father's mood to turn. There was never one moment when the shift became obvious. No single event that marked the beginning of the unease, because it settled into our lives slowly, like fog rolling across a field, until you could not remember a time when the air had been clear. My earliest memories are scattered impressions rather than scenes. I can fully recreate the muffled slam of a door, Caroline crying in another room, my mother speaking softly to calm my father, though her words always trembled at the edges. When I was little, I often believed families simply lived like this, that we behaved in careful ways to avoid something unspoken but inevitable. My father never needed to lift his hand for us to feel the tension he carried, because the threat lived in the hard set of his jaw or the way he stared too long at something small, as if searching for a reason to explode. He could be affectionate when others were watching, yet behind closed doors, his approval felt conditional, tied to whether the world around him matched whatever ideal he clung to that day. If a toy was left out or a chore unfinished, his correction came swiftly, not necessarily through physical action, but through a piercing anger that took hours to dissipate. I learned quickly that shrinking into silence and nodding along with whatever he insisted was the easiest path to safety. Caroline adapted differently. She became skilled at redirecting his frustration, slipping into the role of perfect daughter whenever tension rose. She knew when to flatter him and when to offer an explanation that placed blame anywhere but on herself. Even as children, I noticed how her tears seemed to matter more, how her version of events was accepted without question. If something broke, I apologized even if she had been the one holding it. If we argued, my father declared she was simply more sensitive and therefore needed to be protected from my imagined harshness. Over time, the pattern hardened into something that felt unavoidable. Whenever my father was upset, I braced myself regardless of whether I had been involved. I remember moments when objects flew past me, not aimed at me yet, powerful enough to make my stomach clench. A toolbox knocked from a counter after he lost patience fixing a loose hinge. A remote skidding across the carpet after a football game went poorly. None of these moments seemed alarming at the time, because each was followed by a justification delivered in the heavy voice of a man convinced the world had wronged him. These episodes shaped the rhythm of our childhood. If Caroline complained, he sided with her. If I raised concerns, he accused me of exaggerating or playing the victim. His favorite phrase, echoing through years of arguments, was, "Stop being dramatic," as though any discomfort I felt existed only because I refused to swallow it. The more he dismissed my voice, the less I trusted my own perceptions, and by the time I reached high school, I had learned to question every reaction before expressing it. The summer I turned 12, I remember a moment that should have stood out more clearly than it does. I had been standing near the kitchen table helping set plates for dinner when the room suddenly tilted. I woke up on the couch with a cold cloth pressed to my forehead and my father telling me sternly that I must have fainted in the heat. I recall Caroline sitting nearby, looking oddly unsettled, yet she said nothing. At the time, I accepted their explanation because challenging it felt dangerous. When I touched the side of my head later, I found a tender bump, but I convinced myself it was nothing. That was the beginning of what I now understand as the fog that settles around childhood trauma, the quiet erosion of certainty that makes it difficult to determine which memories are true and which have been reshaped out of self-preservation. As I grew older, the subtler forms of control became clearer. My father questioned my choices, dismissed my achievements, and framed any independence as betrayal. When I left for nursing school, he told relatives I had abandoned the family, even though he had barely acknowledged my acceptance letter. Caroline, meanwhile, remained close to him and kept me informed of his moods, as though I were still responsible for their stability. Every holiday visit carried the familiar weight of walking on thin ice. If I offered advice about Caroline's finances, he snapped that I thought I was better than them. If I suggested he seek help managing stress, he insisted I was overstepping. I learned to choose my words carefully, but even that was not always enough to stop the sudden shift in atmosphere. There were moments when he gripped my arm just a little too tightly to pull me aside, not enough to leave a mark, yet forceful enough to remind me of an unspoken hierarchy. I never told anyone about those moments, partly because I did not want to believe they meant something and partly because explaining them required confronting how much of my childhood had been shaped by fear. The more distance I gained, the more I tried to convince myself that the past was simply complicated rather than harmful. Yet whenever I returned home, the old instincts resurfaced like reflexes I could not fully unlearn. It was only after Thanksgiving, when the doctor revealed something had been inside my skull long before that night, that I began to question everything through a sharper lens. Before that revelation, I had accepted the past as a series of misunderstandings or normal family conflict because it was easier than admitting that the fear I had carried since childhood had been rooted in something real. In the aftermath, I realized that every silenced objection, every redirected blame, every moment of sudden anger had shaped our family into something fragile and distorted. And that history, the quiet erosion of safety over decades, had prepared the ground for what ultimately happened on Thanksgiving. In the week leading up to Thanksgiving, the tension within our family began its slow, predictable climb, the kind that never erupted all at once, but revealed itself in small comments and carefully disguised resentments that slipped between conversations like cold drafts through an unsealed window. Caroline had called me 3 times in 2 days, each request sounding more frantic than the last, as she insisted that the entire meal depended on me covering the cost of everything from the turkey to the cranberry sauce to the pies she claimed she did not have the energy to make. She framed it as practicality, saying she was overwhelmed with her work schedule. Though the last I had heard, she was only picking up occasional shifts at a local boutique. At first, I tried to remind myself that contributing to the holiday meal was not unreasonable, but the way she said it carried an expectation that felt heavier than the words themselves. When I suggested we split the expenses, she sighed loudly and said she thought I, of all people, would understand how stressful things were for her since I made more money and lived alone without responsibilities. The remark caught me off guard in its sharpness, and I hesitated long enough for her to fill the silence with a guilt-edged statement about how Dad had been counting on a proper Thanksgiving and that it would devastate him if the day fell apart simply because I refused to help. It was the familiar script once again placing me in the role of problem solver, but this time the weight of it pressed harder. Maybe because something inside me was growing tired of being the steady one in a family that demanded more than it gave. When I finally arrived at the house the following morning, the atmosphere carried the brittle tension of a storm waiting to break. The air felt tight, as though the walls themselves had absorbed years of arguments and were bracing for another. My father greeted me with a curt nod, barely glancing up from his recliner. The television was muted, but the remote remained clutched tightly in his hand, as if he needed something to anchor the restless irritation radiating from him. Without looking at me, he remarked that it was about time I showed up and that Caroline had done most of the work already. I wanted to respond, but before I could, Caroline entered the living room announcing exaggeratedly that she had handled everything alone except the expensive items Melissa was supposed to buy. Her tone made it sound as though I had broken some agreement, even though the conversation we had barely justified the pressure she now placed on me. I forced a polite response, but the moment hung heavy between us. Throughout the day, small remarks chipped away at my composure. When I arranged ingredients on the counter, she commented that I chopped vegetables too slowly. When I suggested cooking times, she corrected me abruptly, saying Dad did not like things prepared that way. When I checked in on the turkey roasting in the oven, she accused me of hovering as though I were trying to take credit for her efforts. None of these comments were overtly hostile, yet each one carried a subtle sting, carefully designed to unsettle without appearing malicious. My father contributed in quieter but equally jarring ways. He muttered under his breath whenever I passed by, questioning why I had come at all if I planned on criticizing everything, though I had said nothing. At one point, he mentioned that I owed the family more than I realized because I had built my life away from them while they had stayed here dealing with responsibilities I would never understand. The words struck a nerve because they reflected a belief he had held for years that my independence was a rejection of him rather than an attempt to create a life beyond the constraints of my upbringing. Later that afternoon, as I set plates on the dining table, I noticed a half-empty bottle of whiskey near his chair. He had not touched hard liquor for nearly 5 years after a health scare forced him to reconsider his habits. Seeing the bottle reopened memories I had worked hard to keep buried, especially the nights from my teenage years when his voice carried the unmistakable slur of anger soaked in alcohol. I asked Caroline quietly whether he had been drinking more recently, and she waved a dismissive hand, saying he was simply relaxing for the holiday and that I always found something to worry about. The dismissal left a sour taste in my mouth, as though concern itself was a flaw. I decided to step outside for air, hoping distance might settle the rising unease. The November cold greeted me immediately crisp and biting, but calming in its clarity. I breathed deeply, trying to shake off the tension building inside my chest. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that the evening might still unfold without incident if I simply kept to my tasks and avoided triggering my father's temper. But when I returned inside, I heard my name spoken in an unmistakably harsh tone. Caroline stood in the kitchen, whispering fiercely into her phone. She told someone that Melissa was acting superior again, and that she had arrived with the same attitude she always carried, as though she were doing the family a favor by showing up. I froze quietly behind the doorway, listening not because I wanted to, but because her words felt like tiny confirmations of fears I had never wanted to acknowledge. She said that I had a way of ruining holidays with my criticism and that Dad was trying his best, but I had never appreciated how much he had sacrificed. The conversation cut off abruptly when she saw me standing there, though she pretended not to notice the hurt that must have flashed across my face. Instead, she smiled tightly as if nothing had happened and resumed her preparations. The hours that followed carried a growing heaviness. My father's voice grew louder each time he spoke. Caroline's comments became sharper. Even the house itself seemed to reflect the tension with its dim lighting and the faint smell of something overcooked drifting from the kitchen. I kept reminding myself that conflict did not have to erupt if I stayed calm. Yet beneath that reasoning lived a deeper truth one I had pushed aside for years. The past did not simply disappear because we tried to outgrow it. It lingered, pressing against us subtly until the right moment exposed everything we had avoided. On the eve of Thanksgiving dinner, that moment felt dangerously close, ready to ignite with the smallest spark. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a thin layer of frost across the windows and a silence that felt deceptive, the kind that suggested calm, but carried an undercurrent of something unsettled beneath it. I woke earlier than the rest of the house, hoping that starting the day quietly might keep the tension from growing, but the moment my feet touched the cold floor, I felt that familiar unease settle into my chest. The scent of roasting turkey drifted faintly from the kitchen, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to imagine that the day might unfold like a normal holiday. Yet even that small hope felt fragile. When I walked into the living room, my father was already in his chair, leaning back with the television turned up just enough that the low rumble of a sports broadcast filled the space. He glanced at me once and nodded, but the expression on his face was already clouded by irritation. The whiskey bottle from the day before sat on the table beside him, not empty but noticeably lower than it had been. That sight alone tightened something in my stomach because I recognized what it meant for the rest of us. Caroline entered the room a few minutes later with a tray of ingredients in her arms, her movements rushed and impatient as though she was already under pressure she had invented for herself. She complained immediately about how much work she had done without help, even though she had insisted the night before that everything was under control. When I offered to take over the side dishes, she rolled her eyes and said she knew exactly what she was doing, implying that my help would only complicate things. Within an hour, the house was loud in a way that felt different from normal holiday noise. Cabinets slammed. The oven door creaked sharply each time Caroline opened it. My father's voice rose harshly whenever the announcer on the television said something he disagreed with. Every sound scratched against my nerves. I tried to stay busy in the kitchen cutting vegetables and stirring gravy, but Caroline kept hovering close, correcting me, moving things I had just placed, insisting that I should listen to her because Thanksgiving was her project. At one point, she bumped into me near the counter, making me drop a spoon, and then snapped that I needed to be more careful because she did not want me ruining her holiday. The accusation stung because it carried an echo of every blame she had shifted onto me over the years. I stepped back, wanting space, but she followed, tossing rapid complaints about how I had not bought enough ingredients, how Dad was stressed because I arrived late, how everything fell on her shoulders, even though the truth was more complicated than she allowed herself to see. By midday, the tension had reached a point where I found myself monitoring every breath as though one wrong exhale might set off another argument. My father had grown more irritable, reacting to small inconveniences as though they were personal attacks. When the television remote slipped from his hand, he cursed loudly enough that the walls seemed to contract with the force of his frustration. I asked gently if he needed anything, and he responded with a sharp comment about how he did not need me hovering. I retreated to the kitchen, feeling the familiar instinct to stay quiet when he was like this, an instinct left over from childhood. The breaking point began with something trivial. Caroline carried a large ceramic tray filled with roasted vegetables to the dining table. As she turned the corner, her elbow brushed the edge of a chair, causing the dish to tilt. Several vegetables slid off, and the tray clattered loudly onto the table, though not enough to cause damage. Before I could even react, she spun around and pointed at me, insisting that I had distracted her. I stood frozen for a second, trying to understand how she had arrived at that conclusion since I had been across the room, but her voice had already risen, and my father had already looked up with that expression that asked what I had done this time. I attempted to explain gently that I had not touched her and had not even been nearby, but she cut me off, accusing me of always undermining her, always making her feel incompetent. The accusation felt absurd and yet painfully familiar. My father stepped in at that moment, siding with her without asking for details, telling me I needed to stop stirring up drama. The injustice of the moment pressed into my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I wanted to walk outside to gather myself, but Caroline moved to the doorway first, as though guarding it. She crossed her arms and told me I was not going anywhere, that she would not let me disappear and ruin the meal again. Her tone carried not only anger, but a strange kind of satisfaction, as though preventing me from leaving gave her proof of control. She thought she deserved. I stepped back, not wanting to escalate anything, but the pressure in the room felt suffocating. It reminded me so sharply of childhood moments when leaving a room had been interpreted as defiance rather than self-preservation. I tried to keep my voice calm as I said I simply needed air, but my father snapped that if I could not handle being part of this family on a holiday, I should not have come at all. His words hit with the force of a truth I had tried to outrun for years. The afternoon spiraled from there. Caroline grew more agitated with every passing minute, commenting loudly about the work she had done alone, even though I had prepared half the dishes. My father drifted between silent brooding and sudden bursts of anger over anything that inconvenienced him. At one point, he yelled at the oven when the temperature fluctuated. At another, he slammed a drawer so hard that utensils rattled out onto the floor. Each incident added another layer to the volatile atmosphere. I focused on small tasks, hoping that keeping my hands busy would keep the peace. Yet the air around us felt brittle, as if the slightest misstep would cause everything to fracture. When I reached for a serving platter, Caroline rushed forward and grabbed it first, brushing past me with more force than necessary. She muttered something about how I always had to be involved, and the hostility in her voice sent a cold ripple across my skin. It was in that moment that I realized we had crossed an invisible line, one beyond simple family tension. Something darker and older had resurfaced. The house felt too small, too filled with echoes of memories I had never fully unpacked. Even the smell of roasting turkey had turned sharp and metallic in my senses. I glanced toward the front door again, but Caroline's pointed look dared me to try leaving. The walls seemed to close in with each breath. In the background, the television commentators talked excitedly about touchdowns, while in our living room, we stood on the edge of something that no longer felt preventable. The air was thick with the kind of pressure that builds before lightning strikes, and though I could not articulate it yet, I sensed with startling clarity that Thanksgiving had already begun to unravel. The hours leading into Thanksgiving dinner unfolded with a mounting heaviness that felt almost tangible, as if the air inside the house had thickened with everything we had not said over the years, and by late afternoon, every sound seemed sharper than it should have been, every movement charged with a tension I could not ignore. Caroline moved through the kitchen with a frantic energy that felt rehearsed, slamming drawers and muttering to herself as though she were carrying the burden of an entire household rather than simply preparing a holiday meal. Each time I offered to help, she brushed me off with a tone that hovered between irritation and accusation, and even the smallest interaction left me feeling as though I had done something wrong. My father remained in his chair for most of the day, yet his presence carried a gravity that dictated the mood of every person in the room. He shifted between long stretches of brooding silence and sudden bursts of commentary, delivered with an edge sharp enough to make me flinch even when the words were not directed at me. The bottle on the end table was almost empty now, and the way he leaned back in the chair told me exactly how far he had gone. His eyes were unfocused but intense, the kind of gaze that had made me shrink as a child and still had the power to unsettle me decades later. When the oven timer beeped, he muttered something about how nothing was ever ready on time, and Caroline rushed to reassure him with an eagerness that carried more fear than affection. I watched them with the mix of sadness and unease, recognizing the pattern that had shaped our lives, and realizing in a painful instant how little of it had changed. As the final dishes came together, Caroline's agitation reached a level that crackled in the air. She complained that the gravy was too thin, that the rolls were not warmed evenly, that I had chopped the herbs too coarsely. None of these things mattered in any real way, but to her they became evidence of my supposed sabotage, and she repeated these claims loudly enough that I knew she wanted my father to hear. When he finally set his remote down, the motion was abrupt, as though something inside him had snapped. He turned toward us with an expression that hollowed my stomach, his voice slicing through the kitchen as he demanded to know why we could not manage a simple family meal without ruining everything. Caroline seized the moment, turning tearful almost instantly, saying she was trying her best, but I had been difficult all day and that she felt unappreciated. I stared at her stunned by how smoothly she shifted her emotions as though flipping a switch, and for a moment I could not find my voice. When I finally spoke, it was quiet, measured an attempt to diffuse the growing volatility, but the tremor in my tone betrayed the truth that I was not as calm as I wanted to believe. I reminded her gently that I had helped with half the meal and that I had only stepped away earlier because I needed air. She scoffed loudly, accusing me of twisting the story again, of always needing to be the hero at the expense of everyone else. Before I could respond, my father abruptly rose from his chair, and the motion was forceful enough that the television remote slid from the armrest onto the floor. His expression had hardened into something that felt both familiar and deeply alarming, a look I associated with the moments when reason slipped from him and only anger filled the space left behind. He took a step toward the kitchen doorway, and the room seemed to shrink. He asked why I always had to start things, why holidays only turned tense when I was around, why I insisted on stirring conflict when Caroline was trying to make everything perfect. His accusations came so quickly and with such conviction that for a moment I questioned whether I had done something to trigger them. I attempted again to explain, but he cut me off, raising his voice and accusing me of being ungrateful and dramatic. Something inside me broke free, then a quiet, weary truth that had been forming throughout the day. I told him I did not want to argue, that I just wanted to leave before things escalated further. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere shifted. Caroline stepped in front of the doorway, blocking my exit with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not anger exactly, but a twisted blend of triumph and desperation, as though preventing me from leaving gave her control she had long craved. She said I always ran away when things got uncomfortable, and that I would not do it this time, that she would not let me ruin another Thanksgiving by making everything about myself. Her voice trembled at the edges, but her stance was firm, and for a heartbeat I felt the house pressing against me from all sides. I looked past her toward the front door, imagining the cold November air waiting beyond it, and I felt a sudden wave of panic rise in my throat. My father moved closer now, standing just behind her, his posture rigid and unyielding. The smell of whiskey clung faintly to him, and his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. He told me to sit down, that we were going to finish this meal as a family, and that my attitude had gone on long enough. His voice dropped to a low, commanding tone that echoed eerily through my memory, because I had heard that same tone in childhood moments I had spent years trying to forget. The sound made something in me revert instinctively to the small, frightened version of myself who had once navigated this house by reading every subtle change in his mood. My breath came shallow, my vision narrowed slightly around the edges, and I felt the unmistakable shift of fear settling into my bones. I said I needed to step outside, that I was feeling overwhelmed, but the moment the words surfaced, he snapped with a force that shook something inside me, telling me sharply to sit down now. The authority in his voice left no room for negotiation. Caroline's eyes widened briefly, not with concern, but with anticipation, the kind that suggested she knew exactly where this was headed and had no intention of stopping it. In that suspended moment, the three of us stood locked in a tableau shaped by years of imbalance. I felt the weight of every childhood memory pressing against the present, and something inside me whispered that whatever happened next would not be something I could easily walk away from. The air inside the house felt electric, charged with a volatility that had been building for far too long, and though I did not yet understand how quickly it would break, I sensed with painful clarity that the spark had already been struck. The moment after my father ordered me to sit down stretched into something thin and trembling, as though time itself had begun to brace for impact. And even though I stood frozen in the narrow space between the kitchen and the dining room, I felt an invisible line snap somewhere deep inside the house. Caroline hovered near the table, pretending to straighten silverware, but her eyes kept flicking toward my father in quick, charged movements that made it unmistakably clear she knew something was coming and chose not to stop it. My father's footsteps were slow at first, the kind that made the floorboards creak with familiarity. But there was nothing familiar about the way he held himself or the way his anger filled the room, like a sudden pressure drop before a storm. I backed up one small step instinctively, not out of defiance, but out of sheer reflex, the kind that arises when the body senses danger before the mind can accept it. The dining table was cluttered with dishes Caroline had worked on all morning, yet their presence suddenly felt irrelevant props in a scene that had shifted into something darker. My father reached the far end of the table and steadied himself against it, his hand brushing against a ceramic serving plate decorated with painted autumn leaves. I remember noticing how still everything felt in that instant, even though nothing about the moment was calm. The smell of turkey hung heavily in the air, mixing uncomfortably with the tension that had been building all day. Caroline stood utterly silent, the chaotic energy she had carried earlier replaced with a tight, expectant stillness. I said quietly that I did not want to argue, that I only wanted to step outside and breathe, hoping the calmness in my voice would soften something in him even slightly. Instead, he turned toward me sharply with an expression that carried not only anger, but a long, simmering resentment I had never fully understood. His voice rose again, accusing me of thinking I was better than the family that I had shown up just to judge, that I had ruined the holiday by bringing my attitude into his home. Each accusation piled onto the next until the words blurred into a single force pressing me backward. I shook my head, trying to form a response, but before I could, the atmosphere in the room tightened as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My father's hand shifted toward the ceramic plate, his fingers curling around its edge with a deliberate slowness that made something cold settle inside my chest. Caroline's eyes widened just slightly, but she did not move. Her inaction felt louder than anything she could have said. My father lifted the plate, not quickly, but with the heavy, determined movement of someone acting on instinct rather than thought, and the room seemed to tilt around the motion. I opened my mouth to speak, to plead, to de-escalate, but the words caught in my throat. The next moment arrived too fast and too slowly all at once. There was a sharp sound not described by pain, but by impact, a vibration that reverberated through the room more than through my body. The world around me flickered like a light struggling to stay lit. The plate slipped from view, though I could not track its arc or where it fell. The air changed the way it does when something irreversible has just occurred. My balance shifted and the edges of the room softened into blurred shapes. Caroline cried out my name, though her voice wavered between alarm and something that sounded uncomfortably like guilt. My father's voice rose above hers, heavy with anger, insisting I had provoked this, that I always pushed him too far, that I made him do things he did not want to do. His words hit me harder than anything else in that moment, because they carried echoes of childhood scenes I had tried to rationalize away for years. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, and though I reached for something to hold onto my hand, met only air. The room dimmed around the edges, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gradual slipping of clarity, as though my senses were being lowered gently into water. I heard Caroline saying we needed help, but her voice drifted further away with each passing second. My father continued to speak, but his words became muffled like distant thunder. I could not tell whether he was yelling or simply repeating the same justification over and over. My knees bent involuntarily, and I found myself sinking downward, not falling exactly, but losing the ability to stay upright. The ceiling lights blurred into streaks of soft white, and I felt a strange calmness wash over me despite the chaos unfolding around me. Caroline's footsteps moved rapidly across the floor, and then the front door opened, the cold air from outside brushing faintly against my face. She must have run to the neighbors or called out for someone, because within moments, unfamiliar voices echoed down the hallway, confused, urgent voices that asked what had happened, even though I could not form the answer myself. I heard my name again, spoken by someone not part of my family, and then felt hands guiding me, carefully, steadying me, the way trained responders do when they approach a situation with caution and concern. The lights overhead grew brighter as I was moved toward the door, and the contrast made the room spin slightly. Through the fading haze, I caught a final fragmented glimpse of my father standing motionless near the table, his face pale yet unrepentant, his posture rigid with the defiance of someone who refused to acknowledge the harm he had caused. Someone said an ambulance was on the way, and the words seemed to drift across a widening distance. The cold outside met my skin with sharp clarity, and for a moment it helped steady the fragmented pieces of awareness still clinging to me. I reached for a breath, but it hitched halfway in my chest. Another sound followed, then a rising wail that I recognized instantly, the unmistakable siren that signals emergency response. As the world around me dimmed further, I tried to hold on to one coherent thought, but it slipped through my grasp, leaving me suspended in a strange quiet that felt both heavy and distant. When consciousness returned, it did not come in a rush, but in slow, uneven waves that drifted in and out like a tide, unsure whether to advance or recede. And the first thing I recognized was the muted hum of machines, followed by the soft, rhythmic beeping that had been the backdrop of so many shifts in the ER. Only this time, I was not the one standing beside a patient offering reassurance or gathering information. I was the one lying on a hospital bed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights that made everything feel both too bright and too distant. My mind tried to assemble the sequence of events that had brought me here, but each memory surfaced only partially blurring around the edges before fading again. I opened my eyes fully and saw the curtain partially drawn around my bed, the familiar pale blue fabric swaying slightly whenever someone passed on the other side. The scent of antiseptic settled into my awareness, grounding me in the reality that I was not dreaming. My head felt heavy, not with sharp pain, but with a muted pressure that made clarity difficult. My body felt oddly disconnected, as if I were observing from just outside myself. The soft murmur of voices hovered nearby. I heard a nurse say my name, gently asking if I could hear her. I tried to respond, but my voice caught emerging as only a faint whisper. She smiled reassuringly, telling me I was safe and that the doctor would be in soon. I nodded slightly, though even that small motion made the room shift for a second. As I lay still, the events from the house flickered again, not as solid images, but as sensations, the tense air. Caroline's frantic movement, my father's rising anger, the sudden impact that had splintered the day into before and after. I inhaled carefully, grounding myself in the steady rhythm of the monitors beside me. After a few minutes, the curtain moved and Dr. Hopkins stepped inside. He was someone I knew by reputation, a calm, steady presence in the ER, someone who approached situations with quiet seriousness. Seeing his expression made something inside me tighten because he did not look simply concerned. He looked cautious in the way physicians do when their words must be chosen carefully. He greeted me softly, asking how I felt. I told him the room still wavered slightly and that my thoughts were coming together slowly. He nodded, taking a seat on the stool beside my bed, his posture deliberate as though giving me the respect of time before he spoke. He explained first that they had done imaging to assess the injury and reassured me that I was stable. The clarity in his voice steadied my breathing until he paused that brief shift enough to signal something deeper. He continued by saying they found evidence of an object that likely came from whatever had struck me earlier that day. He did not linger on descriptive details, but spoke with a precision that avoided causing unnecessary alarm. I listened, trying to stay focused even as my stomach tightened. Then he said there was something else, something unexpected. The air felt suddenly colder, though nothing in the room had changed. He said the imaging revealed another object near the same region of my skull, one that appeared older, significantly older. His tone did not dramatize the discovery, but conveyed its seriousness through measured phrasing. He said they could tell from the way it sat against bone structure that it had likely been there for years. He asked gently if I had ever experienced a head injury in childhood, one severe enough that something foreign might have entered without being removed. His question echoed inside me not because I had an answer, but because for a moment my mind went blank as though searching for a memory buried too deeply to reach. Childhood injuries came to mind, the scraped knees, the bruises from climbing trees, the occasional fall, but none of them explained something like this. The more I tried to remember, the more the edges of my recollections blurred. Finally, I shook my head slowly, unsure whether the motion was an answer or simply a way to steady myself. Dr. Hopkins waited without pressing. He said they would need to run a few more assessments, but reassured me repeatedly that I was not in immediate danger. Still, the words sat strangely in my mind because the idea of something hidden inside me for years carried its own quiet weight. As he spoke, my thoughts drifted unbidden to the faint scar on my head, the one I had always accepted without question. It had never seemed important, only a small detail from childhood, overshadowed by bigger memories. Yet now it resurfaced, carrying a new and unsettling significance. The doctor continued explaining that the object was small but distinct and that its placement suggested an impact rather than an accidental embedding. I tried to absorb his words, yet they felt like puzzle pieces from a picture I had never seen. For years, I had lived with the vague sense that my childhood held shadows I could not quite define, and now something physical, something real had emerged from that fog, as if offering proof I never asked for. My breathing grew uneven, and Dr. Hopkins paused again, asking if I needed water or if I felt lightheaded. I told him I was fine, though my voice did not sound convincing even to my own ears. After a moment, he gently asked whether there had ever been incidents at home, moments I perhaps dismissed or could not fully recall. The question pressed against a part of me I had kept closed for decades. I felt a sudden flutter of confusion, shame, fear, and something else I could not yet name. Memories tried to surface but dissolved before forming fully. I remembered my father insisting I had fallen once when I was young. Remembered the discomfort in his voice when I asked questions. Remembered Caroline repeating his explanation, even though she had been too little to know. The realization pressed heavily, though still without clear shape. Dr. Hopkins assured me again that we would take this step by step, that nothing needed to be solved immediately. He said sometimes trauma distorts memory, and sometimes the body remembers what the mind cannot. The phrasing lingered with me as he stood and said he would return after reviewing the imaging with a specialist. When he left the room, silence settled in around me, divided only by the steady beeping of the monitor. I stared at the ceiling, trying to contain the rising storm inside me. The object found that day was concerning, but the older one, the one whose origin hid somewhere in my childhood, carried a deeper weight. In that quiet hospital room with the familiar scent of antiseptic and the soft rustle of nurses moving behind curtains, I realized that whatever had happened on Thanksgiving was only the beginning. Something long buried had shifted, and now the fragments of my past were rising one by one, demanding to be seen. When Dr. Hopkins left the room, the silence that followed did not feel restful, but charged, as though the air itself had begun to vibrate with questions I had never dared to ask, and even though the lights above me hummed steadily, I felt an unsettling pull toward memories that had lived for years behind a locked door in my mind. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that I was safe now that whatever the scans had revealed was being handled with care. Yet the thought of an object lodged inside my skull from childhood created a disorienting sense of distance between who I believed I was and who I might have been before I understood the world around me. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking maybe the darkness would help me focus. But instead, it brought flickers of vague impressions, the sound of something falling, my father's raised voice, a dim room from years ago, my mother's hushed tone, and then nothing clear enough to grasp. When the curtain rustled again, I opened my eyes expecting the doctor to return, but instead, my Aunt Linda stepped inside her expression, etched with the kind of concern that comes from a place deeper than simple worry. She stood quietly for a moment, as though searching for the right words before approaching the side of my bed. I had not seen her in months, though I had always felt closer to her than to most of my relatives. There had been something steady about her presence when I was young, a gentle awareness she carried that made me feel seen, even when no one else noticed the tension in our home. Now as she looked at me, I sensed she already knew more than I did. She asked softly how I felt, and I told her I was still trying to understand everything. The attempt at calm in my voice did not fool her. She pulled up the chair beside the bed and sat with the kind of slowness that suggested she was preparing herself for something difficult. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at them for a moment before speaking. She said the hospital had contacted her because she was listed as an emergency contact, something I had forgotten I had done years ago after recognizing she was one of the only people in the family I trusted. She said when she heard what had happened, she came immediately. The relief in her voice contrasted sharply with the tension around her eyes, as though she was relieved I was conscious but distressed by what might come next. When she finally met my gaze, she asked gently whether the doctors had told me about the scan results. I nodded, though the full meaning of them had not yet settled into place. She hesitated again, then inhaled deeply, the kind of breath people take before stepping into cold water. She said there was something I needed to know, something she had suspected for years but never had proof of. My heart tightened. She explained that when I was 6, there had been an incident, a moment in our house that had never been spoken of outside the family. She said she had not been there when it happened, but my mother had called her afterward in a state of quiet panic, describing how I had been hurt, how there had been tension between my parents, how my father had insisted it was nothing more than a childhood fall. My pulse quickened, though I tried to stay still. Linda said that she remembered visiting the house a few days later and noticing the way I flinched when someone raised their voice, how I avoided the kitchen table, how the left side of my head had been tender when she hugged me. She said she had asked my parents about it and they insisted I had simply slipped near the counter. She asked if I remembered any of it. I wanted to say yes, wanted to confirm some detail that would make the moment real, but my memories from that age were disjointed fragments that dissolved whenever I tried to hold on to them. I shook my head slowly. Her expression softened into something that looked like sorrow mixed with long-held frustration. She continued speaking carefully as though each word might reopen old wounds. She said she had always believed something more had happened, something that had been covered up not out of malice, she hoped, but out of fear, denial, or misplaced loyalty. She had never confronted my parents directly because by the time she realized the severity of the situation, my mother had withdrawn emotionally, and my father had become defensive any time the subject surfaced. She said she regretted not pushing harder, but at the time, she had been told repeatedly that I was fine, and she had been afraid of causing additional harm by stirring conflict she could not resolve. Hearing this ignited a strange sensation inside me. Not anger exactly, but a slow dawning of recognition as though a long unsolved equation in my life had finally gained missing variables. Memories shifted slightly, aligning with her words. The faint scar, the unexplained tenderness as a child, the way my father grew tense whenever I asked about it, the way Caroline had repeated his explanation even though she was too young to remember. The realization that something in my childhood had been hidden intentionally made the air feel heavier. I inhaled carefully, trying not to let the rising emotion overwhelm me. Linda reached for my hand lightly, not gripping, just offering the presence of comfort. She said that the doctors had shown her the scan with my permission listed, and that the older object, the one embedded near bone, had shocked her, even though she had felt for years that something about my childhood injury had not been fully explained. Her voice lowered slightly as she admitted she believed my father's temper had played a role in whatever happened that day long ago. She said she had seen moments when his anger crossed lines that should never be crossed, and that my mother had often tried to smooth over the damage to avoid drawing attention to the dysfunction within their home. The thought pressed into my chest with enough force to steal a breath from me. She said she knew this revelation was painful, but she needed me to understand that what happened on Thanksgiving did not come out of nowhere. It was part of a pattern, a long-buried truth I had been carrying without knowing its shape. My throat tightened, and for a moment I could not speak. I felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity, a sharp awareness that the fear I had carried for so many years had roots deeper than I ever recognized. Linda squeezed my hand gently, telling me she was here for whatever came next, that I did not have to face this alone. The reassurance settled over me like a fragile shield against the storm building inside. As she sat beside me, the realization continued to unfold. The object found in my skull was not just a medical discovery. It was evidence, a fragment from a past I had been told to forget or reinterpret. It had remained there silently, marking the divide between what I had believed and what had actually been true. In that quiet hospital room surrounded by soft beeps and distant footsteps, the truth of my childhood rose from the shadows and settled firmly into the present. It did not come as a single memory, but as a confirmation that the fear, the unease, the fog I had lived with for years had not been imagined. It had been buried. Now it had surfaced. When the truth settled in the hospital room between Aunt Linda and me, it did not arrive with clarity or relief, but with a kind of quiet devastation, the realization that the story I had been told about my childhood had been rewritten for me long before I was old enough to understand what truth even meant. But the consequences of that truth did not stay contained within the four walls of my hospital bay. They began to ripple outward the moment the hospital filed its mandatory report, a step required by Pennsylvania law whenever there is any indication of domestic violence or a past injury involving a minor that might have been concealed. Even though I was an adult now, the discovery of an old embedded object alongside the incident on Thanksgiving raised enough concern that the case could not be ignored. Detectives arrived the next morning, moving quietly through the ER, speaking to nurses, requesting charts, conferring with Dr. Hopkins, all while maintaining the calm professionalism I had seen countless times during my own shifts. But experiencing it from the patient's perspective made everything feel sharper, more intrusive, as though my life were being lifted piece by piece into the light for examination. When they stepped into my room, their voices were gentle but deliberate. They asked me to recount the events of Thanksgiving as best as I could. I spoke carefully, choosing words that conveyed reality without spiraling into the emotional undertow waiting beneath each memory. They asked about the plate, though they phrased the question neutrally, and asked whether the impact had been intentional. The pause before I answered felt impossibly long, even though only a few seconds passed. I told them the truth as much as I could, without crossing into assumptions. I said my father had been angry that he had been drinking, that Caroline had prevented me from leaving, and that the moment before the impact had been filled with words sharp enough to leave marks of their own. They exchanged glances, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that indicated the pieces forming in their minds aligned with concerns they already had. When they asked about childhood injuries, something in my chest tightened. I told them what I remembered, which was only fragments, but then relayed what Linda had told me. The detectives wrote everything down with careful precision. One assured me none of this was my fault, and though the words were meant to comfort, they cracked something inside me, a splintering recognition that I had spent decades absorbing blame that had never belonged to me. After they left, Linda remained by my bedside, her posture both protective and resigned. She knew what came next because she had seen it before in other branches of our extended family. Serious accusations in small towns did not confine themselves to those directly involved. They spread quickly, weaving themselves into conversations, text threads, whispered judgments at church gatherings. And this family, the Carter family, had always operated by a long-standing motto, keep problems inside the house. But now the problems were outside. They were documented. They were part of an official investigation. The ripple began almost immediately. Caroline called my phone repeatedly, though I did not answer. When she realized I would not pick up, she called Linda instead, demanding to know why she was at the hospital, why detectives were involved, why I was making a spectacle out of something she insisted had been blown out of proportion. Her voice had the frantic pitch of someone losing control of the narrative. She claimed I had exaggerated everything. She insisted my father did not mean it. She said she had only blocked the doorway because she did not want me to storm out like I always did. Linda listened without responding, her silence more powerful than any argument. Later that afternoon, the first wave of messages arrived from cousins, aunts, distant relatives, each carrying their own mixture of tone. Some were concerned, asking whether I was all right and trying to piece together the fragments they had heard. Others sounded defensive before even knowing the details, as though speaking against the family was a betrayal. A few asked outright what my father had done, but most danced around the truth using phrases like misunderstanding or family disagreement. That was how this family had always described conflict. Harmless words meant to disguise harm. But it was Linda who shifted the tide. Not through dramatics, not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful: facts. She reached out quietly to the relatives she trusted most, sharing only the essentials: that I had been injured, that the hospital had found something from childhood, that suggested a much older incident, that detectives were involved because the situation was serious enough to require it. She did not embellish or speculate. She simply told the truth. And truth, even whispered, carries weight. Within hours, the tone of the messages began to change. Cousins who had once idolized my father began asking questions of their own. Aunts who had always defended him now hesitated. The silence from some family members spoke even louder. Caroline grew frantic. She began sending long, rambling texts accusing me of destroying the family, then following them with apologies claiming she had been overwhelmed. She insisted Dad was heartbroken, that he was confused, that he felt betrayed. But beneath her emotional swings lived something unmistakable: fear. Because the story she had crafted, the version in which she and my father were simply victims of my supposed dramatics, could not withstand the scrutiny of actual evidence. When the detectives contacted her for a formal interview, she called Linda again, demanding she intervene. Linda refused. She told Caroline she needed to tell the truth, and the silence on the other end of the line was so sharp she recounted it to me later with a sadness that revealed how deeply she had hoped Caroline would choose differently. Meanwhile, word spread among distant relatives. Some reached out apologetically, saying they had always sensed something was off in our home, but never felt it was their place to question. Others admitted they were not surprised. A few defended my father half-heartedly, clinging to the belief that adults sometimes overreact, that memories distort with time. But even those relatives fell quiet when Linda mentioned the medical scans, the object embedded near bone, the undeniable record of an injury that should have never been hidden in the first place. The most unexpected shift came from an uncle I barely knew, someone who had always kept to himself at family gatherings. He texted me saying he remembered arguments from years ago, remembered the tension in the house, remembered my mother looking afraid. He said he should have done more. He said he was sorry. His message made my chest tighten in a way I had not expected, because it was the first time someone in my father's generation acknowledged the truth without excuses. By the end of the day, the family was no longer unified in denial. Lines had been drawn not by me, but by the facts themselves. Some relatives withdrew entirely, unwilling to involve themselves. Others moved toward me quietly, offering support. Caroline remained erratic, trying to reshape the story by calling relatives individually, hoping one version or another would stick. But the investigation had already set its course. The truth was out of her hands. And for the first time in my life, I sensed the balance shifting not in my favor exactly, but toward something resembling clarity, a slow but steady dismantling of decades of silence. When the investigation moved into its next phase, my father and Caroline reacted exactly as I should have expected, yet somehow their responses still struck me with a force that left me breathless, as though even after everything I had lived through, I had not fully accepted how far they would go to protect their version of reality. The detectives reached out to them first for formal statements, and almost immediately, the two of them began crafting a narrative so distorted it felt surreal to hear pieces of it relayed to me through the investigative team and through the relatives they had frantically contacted. My father's claim was simple and repeated with unwavering confidence I had slipped nothing more. He said the kitchen had been hectic, that I had been rushing around trying to do too much, and that in the chaos I bumped into the table, causing the plate to fall and graze me as it shattered. He insisted there had been no argument, no raised voices, no confrontation. According to him, I had always been sensitive and dramatic, and the stress of the holiday must have overwhelmed me into believing the accident was intentional. When the detectives asked him why neighbors reported hearing shouting, he attributed it to excitement over the football game. He said the household had been perfectly calm aside from the noise, and that Caroline had simply panicked because she overreacts. Hearing this from the detective later filled me with a cold, sinking feeling, not because I was surprised, but because it demonstrated how deeply he believed the story he was inventing, or perhaps how deeply he needed to believe it. Caroline's version was even more elaborate. She told relatives that I had been emotional all day, that I had snapped at her without reason, that I had stormed toward the door in one of my moods and collided with the edge of the table. She painted herself as the distressed sibling, trying desperately to help, saying she called out to me when she saw me fall and that she had begged Dad to call for help. In her narrative, she was the hero, the steady one, the sister who had tried everything to keep the peace in a house I had disrupted. She even went so far as to tell one cousin that I must have hit my head the day before Thanksgiving while unloading groceries and not realized it until later. The desperation behind her storytelling was palpable. Relatives texted me screenshots of her contradictory explanations, not sure what to believe since she seemed unable to keep her lies consistent. When one aunt questioned why Caroline had blocked the doorway if she was supposedly helping, she immediately backtracked, claiming she had only been trying to prevent me from slipping again. Her excuses tangled themselves into knots, yet she clung to them fiercely because the alternative was admitting that she had stood by during something she could have stopped. The detectives saw through both narratives quickly. They had already spoken to neighbors who heard shouting that did not match the tone of a quiet holiday afternoon. They reviewed the photos from the scene, noting the trajectory of ceramic pieces, details that did not align with a simple fall. They compared each of our accounts and noted the inconsistencies. When they called my father back for follow-up questions, he grew defensive, accusing them of targeting him unfairly. He told them I had been difficult since childhood, that I had a habit of misinterpreting things, projecting emotional weight where none existed. He said I had run off to pursue my own life, abandoning the family, and now I was looking for attention. One of the detectives later told me gently that individuals who have held control for years often react this way when confronted with accountability. But even knowing that did little to soften the emotional sting of hearing my own father dismiss my reality with such ease. Caroline, meanwhile, attempted to salvage her image through a series of frantic calls to relatives who had begun distancing themselves from her. She claimed I had manipulated Aunt Linda, that Linda had always favored me. She said the doctors were exaggerating, that hospitals often made mistakes, that scans could be misread. When confronted by one cousin who asked why the older object had been found, she shifted the blame to me again, suggesting I must have had some other accident and probably forgot. The more they pushed, the weaker her explanations became. At one point, she messaged me directly claiming she never meant for things to escalate, and that if I had just been calmer, none of this would have happened. The message ended with a plea and a threat intertwined. She begged me to retract my statement, then warned that the family would never forgive me if Dad suffered legal consequences because of my exaggeration. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a mixture of sadness and clarity. It was the same tactic she had used throughout our lives, layering guilt and fear into a single breath, hoping one or the other would trap me. This time, it did not work. When she realized I was not responding, she returned to frantic mode, telling relatives that detectives were twisting her words and that I had turned everyone against her. But the relatives she contacted were no longer receptive. Too much had surfaced too quickly for them to ignore. Linda had already shared the factual parts of the case with them, the scan results, the investigation, the doctor's concerns. Facts had a way of steadying the truth, even in a family accustomed to denying it. My father made one final attempt to regain control. He tried calling me from an unknown number and left a voicemail spoken in a tone calculated to sound wounded. He said he loved me even though I had hurt him deeply. He said families should resolve things privately, that involving outsiders was a betrayal. He said real daughters stood by their fathers and did not invent stories that could ruin a man's life. Hearing the message not only tightened my throat, but sharpened my resolve, because for the first time I recognized clearly the strategy he had used all my life. Rewrite the story shift, the blame appeal to obligation, and count on silence. He did not know that silence had already been broken by something stronger than fear. Evidence. Memory rising. Truth finally refusing to stay buried. The detectives told me that the next phase of the investigation would involve comparing all statements against the physical evidence and examining the older injury. They assured me that contradictions were expected, but that the consistency of my account, combined with the medical findings, created a foundation difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, Caroline and my father continued their attempts to reshape the narrative, but their voices no longer carried the authority they once had. Relatives who once defended them now paused before speaking. Others avoided them entirely. And though I did not take pleasure in their unraveling, I felt a quiet shift inside me, a recognition that the grip they once had over me had begun to weaken, not because I fought harder, but because the truth finally had something to stand on. When the detectives told me they wanted a final round of questioning involving all parties, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly, but a quiet, trembling anticipation. The sense that a moment I had been unconsciously moving toward my entire life was finally waiting on the other side of a door I could no longer avoid. They explained that my father had agreed to come in for additional clarification, though his cooperation was strained at best, and that I would have the option, not the obligation, to speak with him under supervised conditions. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then, almost before I understood why, I agreed. Not because I wanted confrontation, but because something inside me needed to hear him say the words he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The interview room was colder than the rest of the station and held the faint, sterile smell of old paperwork and recycled air. I had seen rooms like this countless times as a nurse when officers escorted patients for statements, but sitting in one made the space feel different. Smaller, tighter, charged with an undercurrent of something heavy. A detective sat beside me, not intruding, simply present a steady anchor in a space where the ground felt unstable. When the door opened, my father stepped inside slowly. For the first time in my life, he did not seem larger than the room. He seemed diminished, though not weakened. A kind of rigid defiance held him upright, the kind that came from years of believing he controlled every narrative he touched. He did not look at me at first. Instead, he scanned the room, assessing, calculating, searching for angles he could claim as his own. His jaw tightened when his eyes finally met mine, and in that moment, I recognized something startling. This was not the face of a man grappling with guilt or grief. This was the face of someone preparing to win an argument, even now. The detective introduced the structure of the conversation, outlining boundaries and reminding both of us that this was voluntary. My father nodded impatiently, then leaned back, crossing his arms with the kind of posture that announced he was here under protest. Before anyone could prompt him, he spoke. He said the situation had gone too far. He said he could not believe I would take things to this level. He said families handled things privately and that dragging everything into an official investigation was an act of betrayal. His voice grew sharper with each statement, his frustration blooming into the same familiar tone that had defined my childhood. For a moment, something inside me recoiled instinctively, the old reflex urging me to shrink and de-escalate. But another part of me, newer, steadier, held the line. I told him quietly that the situation was no longer about family disagreements, that there were facts, evidence, medical findings that could not be ignored. His lips pressed together in a thin line. He scoffed. He said doctors exaggerate. He said scans mislead. He said I had always been prone to overreaction. The detective intervened calmly, reminding him that this conversation was meant to clarify, not dismiss. My father's gaze hardened at the interruption, and for just a second, I watched a flicker of something cross his face. Not remorse, not fear, but recognition that he was no longer the authority in the room. When he turned back to me, his expression sharpened. He said I had made him do things he regretted. The sentence hit me with a quiet force. Not because of the words themselves, but because they mirrored something I had heard all my life. You made me do it. Hearing it in this room under these lights, stripped of the house that once amplified his authority, made the phrase sound smaller, almost fragile. I asked him gently what he meant by regret. He stiffened, avoided the question. Redirected. He said I had always been difficult, sensitive, dramatic. He said raising me had been harder than raising Caroline because I refused to listen. The detective asked him if the older injury discovered in my scan meant anything to him. He froze. The shift was slight but unmistakable. A small tightening around his mouth, a quick flick of his gaze to the table before looking away again. He said I probably fell. He said kids fall all the time. He said memories get twisted. But the edges of his voice wavered in a way I had never heard before, betraying something beneath the surface, a crack in the armor he had spent decades maintaining. For the first time, he looked older to me, not physically, but in the hollow way people look when the truth begins to catch up to them. I asked him directly if he ever hurt me when I was a child. Silence stretched across the room like a held breath. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the detective, then back to me. He said he did not remember, which was not an answer. He said I was making accusations that would destroy the family, which was not an answer. He said I was rewriting history, which was not an answer. Something inside me steadied in that moment, not with anger, but with a clear, quiet resolve. I told him I was not rewriting anything. I was finally seeing it. I told him I had spent years believing I was overly sensitive, overly dramatic, overly emotional because he conditioned me to believe that. I told him I had grown up thinking fear was normal because he taught me it was. His nostrils flared. He sat forward as though preparing to unleash another tirade. But the detective intervened again, reminding him firmly that this was not a debate. He sat back deflated and furious. And then something happened that surprised even me. For the first time in decades of navigating his temper, I no longer felt afraid. I felt something else entirely distant. The kind that comes when you finally recognize the truth of someone you once idolized. I said quietly that he no longer had the power to define my story, that whatever he chose to admit or deny was his burden, not mine, that I finally understood I had spent my entire life trying to earn a version of love he was never capable of giving. his face twisted into something unrecognizable. For a heartbeat, I thought he might lash out, not physically but verbally in the way he had always known how to do. But instead, his mouth opened, then closed again, unable to form words. Not because he felt remorse, but because he realized he no longer knew how to control me. The detective ended the session soon after sensing the turning point. As I stood to leave, my father called my name, not sharply, but quietly, almost bewildered. When I turned back, he said only one thing: "You think you know everything." His tone was still stubborn, but it carried something else too, a trembling at the edges, the beginning of a truth he could no longer outrun, even if he would never admit it out loud. I walked out without responding, and for the first time in my life, the weight of his voice did not follow me. The days following the final round of questioning unfolded with a strange combination of slowness and inevitability, as though the truth once spoken aloud and placed into official records had begun moving on its own with a momentum none of us could interrupt. The detectives kept me informed in calm, measured updates, their tone careful but unmistakably confident, the kind of confidence that comes when facts line up with testimony and contradictions collapse under scrutiny. They explained that the district attorney's office had reviewed the case, considered the physical evidence, the medical reports, the statements from neighbors, and the inconsistencies in both my father's and Caroline's accounts. What had once been framed by them as a misunderstanding or exaggerated emotion now existed clearly on paper as a sequence of choices, actions, and consequences. The first charge to be formally filed was assault not of the mild kind my father likely assumed he could talk his way out of, but a more serious classification supported by physical harm and by the context of escalating conflict. When the officers informed him, he reportedly reacted with disbelief, insisting loudly that the system was overreaching, that families fought, that accidents happened. But the investigation had uncovered enough evidence to challenge every excuse. The shattered plate's pattern of impact, the statements from neighbors who heard shouting inconsistent with a calm holiday gathering, the lack of physical signs on me that would support a fall, the earlier medical findings indicating an unresolved childhood injury. All of it built a foundation my father could not manipulate. Caroline was next. Though she had not caused the injury, her involvement had crossed into obstruction. Her shifting stories, her attempt to influence relatives, her denial of blocking the doorway, and her initial refusal to cooperate raised enough concern that she faced her own charge, one categorized under interference with a criminal investigation. When she learned this, she broke down, according to a detective, not with remorse, but with panic. She asked repeatedly why she was being dragged into something she hadn't done and why I couldn't just take it back. But there was nothing to take back. The investigation no longer hinged on my word alone. It had taken on its own shape. When extended family learned of the charges, the shift in their behavior grew even more pronounced. The relatives who had once spoken cautiously now expressed quiet outrage, some privately, some more openly. A few reached out to me with messages that began with, "I am so sorry," followed by memories they suddenly admitted moments they had witnessed my father losing his temper when I was young, or the unease they had sensed in our home, or how I always seemed careful around him in ways a child should never have to be. Hearing these admissions stirred something bittersweet inside me, validation mixed with grief, relief tangled with regret for the years I had spent believing I was the problem. Meanwhile, Caroline isolated herself further. Her social media went silent. Her calls to relatives went unanswered. When she attempted one last time to call me directly, leaving a voicemail filled with frantic apologetics blended with accusations, I listened only long enough to understand that she still believed the issue was not what had happened, but that I had told the truth about it. My father, on the other hand, retreated into a cold, guarded silence, according to those who had encountered him. He offered no apology, no acknowledgement of harm, only complaints about injustice and a stubborn insistence that the world had grown too sensitive. But beneath that was a reality he could not deny. The legal system was not a family gathering where he could raise his voice and expect others to bend. When the summons arrived for the preliminary hearing, the weight of it settled into my chest with a sobering clarity. This was no longer about emotional reckoning. This was about law responsibility and the long overdue consequences of choices he had believed would never catch up to him. The courtroom itself was quieter than I expected on the day of the hearing, its neutral beige walls and polished wooden benches, so familiar and yet entirely foreign. Linda sat beside me, offering a steady presence. Across the room, Caroline sat rigid in her chair, eyes red, her fingers clenched together. She did not look at me. When my father entered, he walked with a stiff gait as though he carried a heaviness he refused to acknowledge. His face remained stony, but something in his posture suggested he knew finally that this was not a situation he could talk his way out of. The judge reviewed the case summary aloud, the details delivered in a formal tone that gave them a weight far different from the emotionally charged version I had lived. Hearing the events recited that way, stripped of denial, stripped of manipulation, filled me with a strange, fragile stillness, not triumph, not satisfaction, just truth being named plainly for the first time. The prosecutor argued that the evidence supported the charges, clearly the assault, the intent suggested by the escalation, the obstruction by Caroline. My father's attorney tried to push back, claiming the event had been an accident, but each time he attempted to undermine the facts, the prosecutor countered with documentation testimony or medical analysis. It became increasingly clear which version of events held up under scrutiny. After reviewing all statements, the judge ruled that the case would move forward to trial, but before adjourning, he addressed my father directly. He said there was a concerning pattern in the evidence, one that suggested a history of anger and intimidation within the home. He said that regardless of excuses, an adult is responsible for their actions, especially when those actions cause harm. My father's jaw tightened, his mouth forming a thin line of contained fury. But he said nothing. After the hearing, the district attorney's office offered a plea agreement, one that would avoid trial if my father accepted responsibility. He refused. It was exactly the response I expected. For him, admitting guilt would mean acknowledging a truth he had spent his entire life denying. Caroline, faced with lesser charges but still terrified, accepted her agreement quickly. She would pay a fine, participate in counseling, and remain under supervised conditions for a period of time. It was not harsh, but it carried a symbolic weight. It acknowledged her role. When my father's trial date was set months later, he finally broke, not with remorse, but with resignation. He accepted a plea deal for a reduced sentence, though still significant. The charges stood officially. The record stood. He would be restricted from contacting me under any circumstance. Listening to the terms felt surreal. Justice had not come as a dramatic thunderclap, but as a series of steady, undeniable truths stacking one atop the other until there was no space left for denial. And while I did not feel joy at the outcome, I felt something else. Something quieter, steadier, like a knot inside me finally beginning to loosen. Recovery did not arrive in a single triumphant moment the way movies and stories sometimes pretend healing works. It came in fragments, slow and uneven, drifting into my life like cautious visitors unsure whether they were welcome. In the weeks after the court decisions, I remained in the hospital longer than I expected, not because my condition was unstable, but because the doctors wanted additional imaging and monitoring while preparing for the surgical removal of the older object discovered near my skull. Each day, I woke to the same steady beeps of medical equipment, the soft shuffle of nurses, and the quiet internal shift between numbness and awareness. My body healed faster than my mind. The impact from Thanksgiving no longer caused dizziness, but left behind a dull, lingering ache that reminded me of everything that had happened. The older injury, however, seemed to hold a deeper power over my thoughts. Knowing it had been inside me for decades created a strange sense of distance between the child I had been and the adult I had become, as though discovering a message from my younger self written in a language I had forgotten. Therapy became a requirement before I even left the hospital, something Dr. Hopkins recommended not as a formality, but as a necessary step before confronting the layers of trauma the incident had unearthed. The first session felt strange. Sitting across from a stranger and describing the most painful parts of my life always did. But the therapist, Dr. Meredith Shaw, listened with an attentiveness that felt steady rather than intrusive. She asked gentle questions without pushing too hard and explained that recovery often begins not with answers, but with the simple act of allowing ourselves to see the truth clearly. She said my mind had protected me for years by burying certain experiences and that uncovering them might feel disorienting at first. In the following sessions, I found myself remembering more subtle details from childhood than I expected. The strange hush that fell whenever visitors came over, the way I flinched instinctively whenever my father raised his hand to gesture the countless times Caroline and I had been told not to upset him. These memories did not strike like sudden revelations, but gathered slowly, forming a fuller picture than the one I had held for most of my life. The day of the surgery arrived quietly. Nurses prepped me with reassuring tones, navigating the process with a professionalism I recognized from my own work. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, a strange calmness settled over me. I had expected fear or anxiety, but instead, I felt a sense of inevitability, as though this was the final step in pulling something dark from the past into the light. When I woke after the procedure, the first thing I noticed was the absence of pressure in a part of my head I had never realized carried tension. Dr. Hopkins later told me the object had been removed successfully, and that while it bore signs of age and corrosion, there was no structural damage remaining. Hearing this made something inside me loosen, a feeling like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Aunt Linda visited often during my recovery. She brought magazines, soft blankets, and warm looks that said more than her words ever tried to. She told me she was proud of me, not because I had gone through something painful, but because I had faced truths people often spend their whole lives running from. She reminded me that I deserved safety long before any of this happened. Her presence became a steadying force, a quiet reassurance that I was no longer navigating everything alone. When I was finally discharged, the transition felt both liberating and unsettling. Leaving the hospital meant stepping back into a world that had changed drastically around me while I had been healing. My apartment felt colder than I remembered. The silence inside it was heavier too, but in a different way, an invitation rather than a burden. I spent the first few days rearranging furniture washing sheets, opening windows to let in the crisp winter air. There was something therapeutic about reclaiming the space, reshaping it into something that felt like mine again. Returning to work took longer. The ER had always been a place where I felt competent and steady, but stepping back into that environment while managing the emotional weight of everything felt premature. My coworkers, however, reached out with a warmth that surprised me. They sent cards, texts, and inside jokes only ER staff would find funny. When they visited me at home, they brought flowers and food and asked nothing of me except honesty. Their care reminded me that family could be chosen and that I had already begun finding one in the unlikeliest place, the break rooms and hallways of a hospital where I had spent years giving more than I received at home. Therapy remained a constant part of my recovery. Dr. Shaw helped me process not only the events leading up to Thanksgiving, but the entire foundation of my childhood. She helped me explore the difference between memories and narratives, between what I had experienced and what I had been told to believe. She guided me not toward closure, but toward understanding, reminding me that healing is not about forgetting, but about releasing the grip the past holds on the present. Slowly, I began feeling more anchored in myself. I started cooking meals again, small ones at first. I took walks through the park near my apartment, letting the crunch of winter leaves under my shoes serve as a reminder that life could feel steady. I practiced saying simple truths aloud, things like it was not my fault or I deserved better, though sometimes the words trembled on their way out. By mid-December, the world outside had shifted into holiday mode. Lights lined the streets, wreaths hung on doors, and children bundled in colorful scarves ran through the cold air with excitement. Watching them stirred something warm inside me, a sense of gentleness I had not felt in years. One afternoon, as snow began falling softly outside, I sat by my window reflecting on everything that had happened, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a quiet sense of belonging inside my own body, a return to myself that was subtle but unmistakable. Recovery was not a single moment of triumph. It was 1,000 small steps of reclaiming the parts of me that had been silenced, forgotten, or reshaped by fear. And as those parts began returning carefully and slowly, I realized healing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the life I had always deserved. Snow fell in slow, drifting patterns on Christmas morning, as though the sky itself had decided to turn gentle again after months of chaos and noise. and I stepped outside, wrapped in a scarf Aunt Linda had knitted for me years ago, feeling the unfamiliar but welcome sensation of quiet settling into my bones. I walked along the narrow path behind my apartment building, the world softened by fresh snowfall, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt grounded rather than weighed down. Each breath I took felt steady, not rushed or panicked, and even though the cold air stung my cheeks, it carried a kind of clarity I had not experienced in years. As I watched my breath rise like pale smoke, I felt the recognition that life had shifted permanently, not in the catastrophic way it had on Thanksgiving, but in a way that suggested I was finally moving forward, rather than circling the same painful memories. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I did not check it right away. I knew the pattern by now. Every few days, some distant relative reached out with a neatly worded message expressing sympathy, outrage, or relief. Some apologized for not seeing the truth sooner. Others offered support in ways that felt genuine for the first time. These messages no longer startled me. Instead, they served as small reminders that people were capable of learning and that my story had not been silenced or dismissed the way so many of my childhood experiences had been. When I finally pulled out my phone, I saw an email from Caroline, a rare occurrence given the court order limiting contact, and though my chest tightened slightly, I opened it. The message was short. She said she was in mandatory counseling and that for the first time she was beginning to understand how deeply our upbringing had twisted her sense of normal. She wrote that she was sorry not just for Thanksgiving, but for all the moments she had chosen to align herself with control rather than compassion. She ended by saying she did not expect forgiveness, but hoped someday she would become someone who deserved a chance to rebuild her life in a healthier way. I did not feel anger while reading it, only a strange, quiet acceptance. Her apology did not erase anything, but it did mark a shift I once believed impossible, and acknowledging that felt like taking another step toward becoming whole. A second notification appeared from the county legal office, confirming that my father's sentencing hearing had concluded. The charges had been processed, the restrictions finalized, and there would be no further need for my testimony. I stood still for a long moment, absorbing that fact. Not because the news surprised me, but because it symbolized an ending that had once felt unreachable. My father had spent years shaping himself into someone who believed control was equivalent to authority, and that fear was the same as respect. Seeing that belief dismantled in a court of law felt like witnessing a door close with a soft but irrevocable click. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and continued walking toward the small park at the edge of the neighborhood. Children were building lopsided snowmen and chasing each other with mittened hands, their laughter carrying through the cold air like the opposite of everything I had grown up with. Watching them reminded me that not all families were shaped by fear, that there were places in the world where softness was the foundation rather than the exception. I found a bench dusted with snow and sat down, letting my thoughts drift. It occurred to me that for most of my life, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I believed surviving meant staying, absorbing, adapting. Now I understood that strength sometimes takes the form of walking away, even when your entire history tells you to stay silent. As I watched the sky brighten slightly behind a veil of winter clouds, I felt a shift inside me, subtle and certain, like a lock turning smoothly in a door that had rusted shut for years. My thoughts drifted to the younger version of myself, the child who learned to stay quiet, the teenager who flinched at raised voices, the adult who carried invisible weight without understanding its source. I wished I could reach back and tell her she had always deserved gentleness. I wished I could tell her she would one day step out of the cycle that had shaped her. As I rose from the bench to continue my walk, a soft wind swept across the park, scattering small curls of snow around me. The world felt spacious, like something had finally widened inside my chest. I thought about the plate on Thanksgiving and the years of fear behind it. And then I thought about the doctor's words, the hidden object, the past that had been silently carried inside me. For so long, I had believed those moments defined me. Now I understood they were only pieces of a story I was no longer trapped inside. Walking back toward my apartment, I felt a sense of calm that was not fragile but steady, as though I had finally learned to inhabit my own life with both awareness and choice. And as I reached the steps leading to my door, I said the words aloud, not for anyone else, but for myself. The plate did not break me. It revealed what was already broken and what I finally had the strength to walk away from. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey, and before you leave, I want to speak to you directly, heart to heart, because if this story resonated with you even a little, then you already know how powerful it is when someone finally chooses themselves after years of being told they should stay silent. If you felt anger on Melissa's behalf, or saw pieces of your own family in the shadows of hers, or simply needed the reminder that healing is possible at any age, then I invite you to take a moment and become part of this community by subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing this video with someone who might need it today. You would be surprised how many people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s watch these stories quietly, never saying a word because they think they are the only ones who went through something similar, and your comment might be the one that makes them feel less alone. Tell me where you are watching, from what state or city, or even what time it is for you right now. This channel has viewers from every corner of the United States and beyond, and reading your comments is one of the most meaningful parts of creating these stories. It turns a lonely experience into a conversation, and a conversation into a community. And if this story made you pause or breathe a little deeper or rethink something from your own past, I hope you will share that too, because your voice matters. It might help someone else put words to something they have carried for decades. Maybe you grew up in a home where holidays felt tense instead of joyful, or you had a sibling who always seemed to be shielded from the consequences of their actions, or perhaps you simply learned to keep the peace even when it cost you pieces of yourself. Whatever your experience is, this channel is a place where your voice is welcome. These stories are fictional, but the emotions behind them are real for so many people, and every time you comment or subscribe, it tells YouTube to show these videos to more viewers who might need to hear them. And if you are someone who has already walked the long road of healing, I encourage you to leave a small message of hope below, something that reminds others that healing is not just possible, but deeply worth it no matter how late in life it begins. If you want more stories like this filled with twists, emotional depth, justice, and the kind of clarity that comes after years of silence, make sure to hit the like button so the algorithm knows you want more. And if you never want to miss a new story, subscribe and turn on notifications. I post regularly, and every story is crafted to honor the strength of people who have survived more than they ever should have had to. You can even share this video with someone who might need it today, because you never know whose life you might touch with a single click. And finally, before you scroll away, let me ask you this. If you could say one sentence to your younger self, one truth you wish someone had told you when you needed it most, what would it be? Leave it in the comments. Someone out there is waiting to hear your words. If you made it this far, thank you for your time, your presence, and your support. I appreciate you more than you know, and I hope to see you in the next story.